Little is known about CSEC, Canada's version of the NSA, what it can do, or how far its reach extends. But our next guest may be able to shed some light on how the Communications Security Establishment Canada works. Joining us now, Wesley Wark. He is professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and we're really grateful you made the trip down the 401 to join us here in Toronto today.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Well, as you know, there's been a huge debate in the United States about what the NSA can and can't do, or should or shouldn't do. We are now coming to realize that we have a similar organization in Canada, and I'm wondering if we're having, as far as you can tell, a similar kind of debate in this country.
We're having no such debate at all. I mean, it's been completely silent on our front in terms of signals intelligence, metadata, what this organization does. And part of that is because when the story broke, I suppose Parliament was out, didn't have a chance to ask much in the way of questions. But in general, I think the Canadian public knows nothing about this organization. The government and the organization itself like it that way. And we're kind of stuck in this cone of silence.
Let's see what we can do about that. Tell us about it. What does it do?
Well, CSEC has been around for a long time now. It's called CSEC. It's been called CSEC since 2008. Its history dates back to the Second World War. It's a signals intelligence agency, which means it collects communications from wherever it can grab communications. It was always a foreign intelligence collector. That's how it began, and that's how it existed throughout the Cold War. But times have changed, communications have changed, targets have changed. So now it exists in a kind of more blurred area, I think, between doing purely foreign intelligence and doing a variety of other jobs for the government.
You say signals intelligence as opposed to human intelligence. They don't run spies on the ground, in other words.
They don't run spies on the ground, and nor do they take photographs from space. They don't run drones or any of those other things that are called imagery intelligence, the other kind of intelligence. So they occupy that very special niche, which is intercepting communications of all kinds.
Can you tell us anything about the $880 million, 6,700 square meter facility that they are about to move into in Ottawa?
It's huge. It looks extremely nice, even though it's under construction. It no longer has the originally planned skating rink, but it, I presume, has a lot of amenities. It's a huge complex. It's part of what will become, in fact, a Canadian intelligence campus. It's right next door to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and that's a deliberate move. It also has to be said that CSEC had been scattered around Ottawa for a number of years. It had outgrown its premises. And the biggest secret, in a way, behind its move is that it also outgrown the capacity to supply itself with electricity. It was about to blow the electric grid in Ottawa if it didn't move to a new premises. Well, it has huge computing power, and it drains a lot of energy to run its computers.
It uses the energy of a small town, I think, doesn't it?
It does indeed, yes. And that's why it has to have its own kind of self-contained electrical grid, which wasn't available in its old CBC headquarters.
As much as you are asking legitimate questions about what its function is, you don't doubt that we actually need it, do you?
No, signals intelligence, no one should doubt that. Signals intelligence is a very vital tool for states collecting intelligence. It's been a premier intelligence tool since the Second World War, and it goes right back to, in terms of operations, World War I. It's been around a long time. Everybody recognizes its value. We wouldn't know what we know about what's going on in Syria, for example, without signals intelligence. The possibility of verifying the destruction of chemical weapons in Syria would be impossible without signals intelligence. No doubt they're keeping a close eye on what's going on in Kenya at the moment in terms of the mall siege. So it's a very vital intelligence tool. But you know, that's fine when you think about foreign intelligence collection. When it begins to intrude on the lives of citizens in one's own country, then it gets a bit trickier in terms of what it does and what its powers are.
Well, and in your first answer, you said one of the things it does is collect metadata.
Yes.
What is that?
Metadata is simply data about networks and communications networks and patterns. And what people often say is, or the original metaphor that was often used was that you can think of a letter and what's in a letter. Metadata is the letter, the envelope, and where it goes, and the stamp on it, and so all the tracking marks around.
Not necessarily the content.
But it's not the letter in the envelope, it's the envelope itself, and all of that flow of information. It's really network analysis. Who sends communication, who receives a communication, the patterns of communication between those 2 points, how long they communicate for, and various other kinds of points of information.
And do we know what percentage of metadata is about foreigners and what percentage is about us?
Well, in the world, under the mandate of the Communications Security Establishment, it is only allowed legally to collect intelligence about activities outside the borders of Canada, and it cannot even collect intelligence on Canadians outside the borders of Canada. So it's meant to be strictly a foreign intelligence agency.
And do we have confidence that that's in fact what it's doing?
Well, the CSE commissioner, who's the oversight person for CSE, says that all is well, but it's a very murky area, and things are changing very rapidly, and there are stories that are breaking all the time, largely courtesy to Edward Snowden these days, which raise more and more questions. So I don't think we can be completely satisfied that it is simply operating beyond the borders of Canada any longer.
Let's go into this oversight capacity that you just talked about. There is a CSEC commissioner.
Yes.
And his or her responsibilities entail what?
Well, the CSEC commissioner, the office has been around since 1996. It was originally established because there were some scandals brewing about signals intelligence in the 1990s and some whistleblowing going on. So they established this agency. The CSEC commissioner is a retired judge, so someone with a lot of legal expertise. The role of that very small office is to ensure that CSE obeys the law and follows ministerial directions. It doesn't have any role in terms of saying, is CSEC any good at what it does, but simply is it law-abiding and does it follow what the minister tells it to do?
But if CSEC, I'm not trying to make trouble here, I'm just asking, if CSEC engages in the world of spying, how does one Ottawa functionary determine if these guys are following the rules?
Well, that's a good question, Steve. I mean, he has access, the commissioner and his small staff, there are 8 people that work for him full-time, have access to all the classified data that CSEC utilizes and has access to itself. So in theory, they have a complete kind of window on CSEC's operations, but they are small, and the world is changing. Communications are changing. There are revolutions going on at a very, very fast pace. So part of the question is, can that very small office really keep up despite its access? How good is it really at keeping alongside CSEC at kind of on the leading edge of these communications developments?
Do you have any reason to believe that CSEC is getting away with stuff they ought not to be getting away with?
I don't have any reason to believe that they're breaking the law, and the CSEC commissioner says they're not breaking the law. The problem is we're not really sure what the law is, and there's actually a dispute between the commissioner, the review body, and CSEC and the government about how the law should look. And when I say the law, I mean the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed in 2001, which gave CSE, as it was then called, its first kind of enabling legislation and mandate. So the commissioner says they're not breaking the law, but he also says the law is not adequate. So they're not breaking a law that is inadequate, is essentially what we're told by the commissioner.
Big loophole there.
There is a big loophole, at least a gray area. And there are aspects of CSEC's operations in terms of metadata, for one, in terms of intelligence sharing with its partners, that we really have very little insight into, and there may be areas there where they're pushing up against the law.
Let's move on into that, because you talk about partners, and CSEC is one of, I guess, what they call the 5 eyes. Yeah. And by that I don't mean like Iran, Iraq, India. It's eyes in the sky that you see with.
Yes.
Tell us about the 5 eyes.
The Five Eyes Partnership, as it's now called, and nobody knows where that name has come from, but that's the ruling name, is a long-established and very, very special intelligence alliance. Canada joined this intelligence alliance back in the late 1940s. The method by which we joined this alliance remains secret and classified to this day, but we've been part of this organization, this grouping, very tight, close-knit club of intelligence powers since the late 1940s and really arguably since World War II. So we're part of this tight club. The idea in this club, it's the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and from time to time New Zealand, is that they share intelligence that they've gathered. They share tasking, burden sharing in terms of who's going to look at what primarily around the world. They share technological resources and research and development. They all have liaison officers posted with each other. So it is a network itself that is designed to ensure that the globe can be covered and that those powers that trust each other to sort of partition the globe and follow major kind of threats and intelligence gathering capabilities can almost instantaneously share what they know. Since
our CSEC is not supposed to be spying on us, do we infer from that they are probably spying on some citizens in the Five Eye Partnership?
No, the Five Eyes Partnership has an apparent written, well, we've never seen it, certainly an unwritten rule that says that thou shalt not spy on your partner agencies.
An unwritten rule?
Yes. So, it may be written, but we've never seen the written rules.
But in other words, if it's unwritten, they're doing it.
Well, I think they're probably not doing it because it wouldn't make sense for them to do it. If you start to do it, it would break down trust. And there's a lot of things to look at in the outside world. So the real problem there among the Five Eyes partnership, I think, is the question of if one of the Five Eyes partners has a lot of data about the citizens of another of those member countries, and even though it's outside the legal mandate of, say, for Canada to collect intelligence on Canadians, if the NSA has collected intelligence on Canadians and decides to pass that information to CSEC, does that break the law? Probably not, but it's a gray area, and we haven't heard from the CSE commissioner of what he thinks about that.
The effect of that would be, I mean, if they do it, but give it to us, the effect of that is that we're kind of doing it, isn't it?
The effect of it is we're benefiting from somebody else collecting intelligence on Canadians that we're not allowed to do. And there's no hard proof that that actually happens, but on the other hand, the reality these days in terms of signals intelligence and metadata collection is that you have this gigantic power south of the border, the National Security Agency, which from all accounts is able to vacuum up global communications on an enormous scale. Those communications are bound to contain a great deal of Canadian content. And it's hard to imagine that that Canadian content, when it's of interest, wouldn't be made available to Canadian government agencies. So.
Agencies, or who's the minister in charge of all this?
The Minister of National Defence is now in charge of CSEC. There used to be a different reporting relationship, which I think is important because it was set up for a reason. For many years, it was that CSEC, for operational, strategic, planning and priority purposes, reported to the National Security Advisor, and for logistics and other things, reported to the Minister of National Defence. But that was changed a couple of years ago, and now CSEC purely reports to the Minister of National Defence.
Do we have, I mean, the Minister of National Defence has, at any time, 10 or 20 huge files on his or her desk.
Yeah.
And this probably isn't a priority on that desk, is it?
Well,
I mean, if
think
you've got troops in Afghanistan, and you know what I'm saying here.
No, sure. I mean, intelligence should be a priority always because it can be vital information. It's not often treated that way in a Canadian context, and we're not often alert to that reality. But it's true, the Minister of National Defence has many problems on his desk, many big files. And CSEC likes to operate autonomously. And so it is, in a way, a bit of a fiction that it is a wholly owned agency of the Department of National Defence. It really operates on its own and has done so for a very long time.
We do have in this country information and privacy commissioners.
Yes.
Do we know whether they are seized of this issue and think it's a problem?
I think they're seized of it, but the fact is, when it comes to CSEC, the job of overseeing what it does and its potential intrusions into privacy was handed over to the CSE commissioner. So the Federal Privacy Commissioner, despite her mandate and her office's mandate, has really given that job to the CSEC commissioner. So he has become not only a review agency for CSEC operations in terms of legality, he is de facto the sort of privacy watchdog for CSEC. And so if you start to ask questions about how well that office does its job, you're asking questions about, are they really on top of legal and ministerial control issues, and are they also really on top of privacy issues? And I think people have legitimate doubts about that.
Can you give us some sense about how the Five Eyes partnership divvies up the world? I mean, is it our responsibility to focus on countries X, Y, and Z, and New Zealand does A, B, and C, or how does it work?
We don't know. We used to know, so I can only give you a historical example. In the Cold War, Canada had a very special niche role, which was to watch northern Russian military and diplomatic communications. So we followed Russian fleet activities in the north and the Arctic, and submarine activities and missile launches, and some diplomatic transmissions that went over the North Pole, because we had a very special station that we built extraordinarily way up high in the Arctic called Alert. And that was a perfect place to siphon all this traffic down to and then begin to intercept it. So we had that niche mission during the Cold War. What our niche mission is now and what anybody's niche mission is, we simply don't know. It's a secret.
We learned the hard way, I guess, back on 9/11, that all of those people who were trying to decode information that came in the United States, who were all excellent at speaking Russian or Czech or something, I mean, we didn't need them at that point. We needed them to speak Arabic. Do we have any idea whether we have the right personnel who speak the languages we want them to speak to do the job here?
Well, there's been crash programs in all the signals intelligence agencies to bring more linguistic expertise in, but I think the reality is that they're increasingly relying on machine translation to do that, and they have extraordinary computational power. I mean, CSEC is the biggest center for supercomputing capabilities in Canada. It's long been, and NSA would outstrip it 20 or 100 times or who knows what. So.
Let's come full circle here and finish where we started, which is, we've seen in the United States that when the public realized that the NSA was doing all of this, and we know what hit the fan. A lot of that is because many Americans hate their government, right? They are incredibly suspicious of their government, going all the way back 250 years to the founding of their country. Is it possible that we have not had a similar reaction here because Canadians don't hate their government as much as Americans do? In fact, Canadians rely on their government for a lot of stuff like Medicare, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's an interesting thesis. I would say that, as you know, there's a division of responsibilities that's built into the American Constitution and checks and balances, and we don't quite have that. We have a different kind of system. I think fundamentally the problem in Canada is that we have far too much secrecy around what security and intelligence agencies do. The governments like it that way. The governments don't understand, and I don't mean either conservative, liberal, it tends to be a habit across parties. They don't understand that it's important for the public to understand this function and to have some capacity to criticize it. So they like to keep it secret. The intelligence agencies like to keep it secret. And the public doesn't, I think, in Canadian context, know enough to be concerned yet. And that's, I think that's our fundamental problem. It's not that we tend to trust government. It's we don't know enough to be alarmed. And we don't have that tradition of whistleblowing and so on. We don't have our Edward Snowdens that can suddenly bring a sensational story into the news.
I don't want to overdo this, but they are about the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we are about the peace, order, and good government, and have been for almost 150 years. Yeah. I mean, there's a little something to this,
There's different, but on the other hand, if you like order and you like good government, you need to pay attention to intelligence, and you want to make sure that intelligence both can do its job well, but also not breaking the law.
Okay, further on that then, what would concern you? For example, if you found out that CSEC was doing X, what would X be and why would that concern you?
Well, there are a number of possibilities. One is it's breaking the law. That's never a good thing because intelligence agencies are intrusive, whether they're a signals intelligence agency or a human organization or whatever. They have intrusive powers. You want them to operate in a democracy within the law. If they're breaking the law, that's not a good thing. If they're operating in areas where there's no real law or no clear law, that's also another problem because if they're operating in that kind of vacuum of authority and legal controls, then it seems to me that creates problems as well. And so part of it is lawfulness and defining that. Part of it is what's the impact on privacy, a big debate that we should be having in Canada, which maybe we will have in the future. And part of it is also about something we hardly ever ask ourselves, which I think we should ask ourselves, is how good are we at intelligence? Now, we spend a lot of money on CSEC. It has about 2,000 people now. It's twice its size when the 9/11 attacks happened. It has this new headquarters. It has supercomputers. We think we're kind of relying on it, but we don't know anything about it. So we have no capacity to say it's good enough at its job, it's terrible at its job, it's doing a fine job. And those are the kinds of questions citizens and governments and opposition parties, parliament, review agencies have to have a capacity to have a dialogue about.
No, fair enough. The institutions of the public ought to be able to look into all of that. But the public itself, much of it anyway, seemed prepared to give up certain asking of questions, civil rights it may have had after 9/11 because it didn't want to get attacked. Are we there today, do you think?
I don't. I mean, I think the Canadian reaction to the 9/11 attacks, just in sociological reaction, was relatively mature. We didn't sort of dive into panic or extremism. The Anti-Terrorism Act that we passed, I think, was relatively tightly controlled, and there was a big debate about it. When we think about these kinds of powers that signals intelligence agencies have in particular, we had a debate about lawful access. And the government proposed this bill, and they labeled it as a bill to give them powers to deal with child pornographers. And the whole thing went south in a terrible way. But there was a big public reaction against the notion that law enforcement or intelligence agencies could simply come snooping into your private communications. And that sends a message to me about how Canadians really think about these things when they're pressed.
So I'll quote Ronald Reagan finally here, who didn't say it about this, but said it about something else. Trust but verify. Is that where you're at on this?
I would say first, don't trust, be better informed, and when you don't trust and you know more, then you're in a position to verify, like arms control.
Gotcha, okay. Wesley, it's awfully good of you to join us here at TVO today. Once again, thanks for making the trip from Ottawa for us. We're really grateful.
Thank you, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.